I discovered my daughter-in-law's plan to bankrupt my son and steal our family business on the same laptop she once mocked me for not knowing how to turn on. She called me old-fashioned, said I should stick to fishing and mowing the lawn, leave the computers to the grown-ups. What she didn't know was that before I was anyone's grandfather, I spent 30 years as a forensic accountant for the Department of Defense, tracing money that was never meant to be found. So when she left her MacBook open on the kitchen counter, I didn't see family photos. I saw encrypted folders, hidden ledgers, offshore accounts tied to my son's name, and a quiet, methodical plan to ruin him, strip the business my father built, and make it all look like his fault. She thought she was clever. She forgot who taught my son how to read a balance sheet before he learned to drive. That night, I sat at my old desk, the same one where I'd signed every paycheck this family ever earned, and opened a fresh file. Title: Counter-Strike, because I wasn't going to confront her. I was going to erase her, on paper, in court, and in every bank that ever heard her name. Before she even knew there was a war, I'd move the battlefield. I closed the laptop softly and locked it in the cabinet beside my desk. I poured a glass of water instead of whiskey and stared at the moonlight on the pond outside. I'd already started a file. I would finish it. I called my son to notify him. "Dad, please don't start," he said. "You don't see what she handles for us." "I see the transfers," I said. "I taught you the ledger before the clutch." "You taught me to trust my wife," he said. "Trust me to manage my own home." "I am," I said. "I'm managing mine." My name is Harold Whitaker. I was 70 that winter, a widower, a father who still ran numbers in pencil before I typed them. I kept our family books the way my father taught me: quiet, exact, no shortcuts. I lived in the house he built, at the oak desk where I had signed paychecks and loan papers. People called me old-fashioned. They were right about the old part. They were wrong about what old men can do. Morning brought no peace, just determination. I unlocked the cabinet and pulled out the MacBook, setting it beside the stack of old ledgers in my office. The safe groaned as I turned the combination I'd set decades ago: my wedding date and the day my son was born. Inside were manila folders stuffed with deeds, tax returns, and the original partnership agreements my father and I had drafted on yellow legal pads. I pulled one labeled Trusts and another marked Offshore. Per the original partnership and trust, I held managing control and unilateral authority to transfer title to protect the business. I cross-checked the accounts from her laptop with our bank statements. Her pattern was plain once you knew what to look for. She transferred funds weekly in amounts under $10,000, using fake invoices from consultants we never hired. Those payments landed in shell corporations that, on paper, were owned by my son. She would later use those falsified debts to force a bankruptcy, seize the business assets to settle them, and pocket our family's work. The audacity of it stunned me. It wasn't enough to take the money. She wanted my son to bear the shame of failure. She'd arranged for default notices to be sent to our best clients timed with his birthday. She had already drafted press releases painting herself as the savior of a failing company. She posted a photo from the office, glass trophy, a caption about legacy. I stared at the line items until the numbers blurred. Then I took a breath, sharpened my pencil, and noted each transaction. Every transfer had a date, and every date would become evidence. As I worked, memories surfaced. I saw my son at 12 sitting at this very desk, counting out pennies into piles, practicing addition. I saw my father teaching me that a ledger tells a story if you listen. I whispered those lessons to myself as I wrote. When the sun set, I closed the offshore folder and slid it to the back of the safe. I placed the new ledgers beside it. There was something gratifying about tangible paper in a world of digital documents. Before bed, I stood in the kitchen and looked at the MacBook again. I wanted to confront her then. I wanted to throw the laptop at her feet and watch her lie. But confrontation without preparation is folly. My career had taught me that. So I slid the laptop back into its sleeve and returned to my desk. On the cover of my notebook, I wrote, "Do not confront. Erase. I would do everything that I can for the revenge. Soon I shall execute my plans." But before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. I had spent my life building a reputation for diligence and discretion. Now I would call in those favors. The next morning I dialed an old colleague, Pete Reynolds, who had retired from the Department of Defense a few years after me. He answered on the second ring. "Pete, it's Harold," I said. "I need to trace some offshore accounts." There was a pause, then a chuckle. "You always did pick the juicy ones." "Send me what you have." I encrypted the spreadsheets and emailed them through a secure channel we had used back when we were tracking illegal arms dealers. Within an hour, he called back. "Your daughter-in-law's fingerprints are all over this," he said. "She's been shifting funds through a network based in Bermuda. One of the companies is registered at a post office box used by a known fraudster." His confirmation galvanized me. I updated the Counter-Strike file with his findings. Then I drove to the bank where we held our business accounts. The manager, an earnest young woman named Karen, shook my hand warmly. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "always a pleasure. What can I do for you?" I leaned in as if sharing a secret. "I need copies of every transfer from Whitaker Enterprises to outside consultants over the past year, and I need to change the signature requirements on the accounts. Effective immediately." She blinked, then nodded. "Of course." Within minutes she returned with a thick envelope. I felt decades of trust between our family and this bank in the weight of those papers. I signed forms revoking my daughter-in-law's access. The pen didn't shake. Back home, I pulled out a new manila folder and labeled it banks. I sorted the statements in my notes. I locked the safe and spun the dial to a new combination: my father's birth year and the year I retired from the Department of Defense. Only I knew it now. Before closing the office door, I glanced at my father's portrait. His eyes seemed to approve. The next week, I became an investigator again. I woke early, brewed coffee, and sat with the spreadsheets until my back ached. Each line told part of the story: a wire transfer here, a false consulting fee there. I traced them forward and backward, cross-referencing them with our legitimate invoices. When I saw a payment to Blue Horizon Consulting, I pulled the original invoice and discovered it was for strategic marketing services. We'd never had a marketing department. I circled the amount in red ink and wrote fraud beside it. Some afternoons I drove to the courthouse and pulled public records. I found liens she had placed against my son's name using debts created by her shell companies. She was setting him up to default so she could swoop in as a creditor and take possession. She had also filed paperwork to have herself appointed trustee of our family trust in the event of my incapacity. I smiled at that. She didn't know that trust instruments are my second language. At night I would sit on the porch, the manila folder on my lap, and read through the documents again. I wasn't looking for new information. I was letting the pattern settle in my bones. It's one thing to see betrayal on a screen, it's another to feel the weight of it in your hands. I remembered my father telling me that a businessman's enemy is never the competitor across the street. It's the opportunist at his own table. One evening, as the cicadas sang and the sun bled out over the horizon, I noticed a date recurring: the 15th of each month. That was when the largest transfers went through. That date happened to coincide with the due date of our employees' health insurance premiums. She was siphoning funds on the very day we paid for our people's care. It made my blood run cold. I underlined the dates and wrote, "Heartless." The pattern led to an attorney's name, Mark Jensen, who had drafted amendments to our trust documents. I hadn't met him. My daughter-in-law had insisted he was family-friendly. I added his name to my notes. I needed to visit him to see his true priorities. I scheduled an appointment with Mark Jensen under the pretense of updating my will. The receptionist smiled too broadly when she said, "He'll be right with you." The waiting room smelled of new leather and deceit. I pretended to thumb through a magazine while watching the paralegal whisper to another staffer. I caught my daughter-in-law's name on their lips and leaned back, letting them think I was too old to hear. When Jensen ushered me into his office, he closed the door and gestured to a chair. "Mr. Whitaker, it's an honor." "How can I help?" I held my cane with both hands. "I want to review the trust documents my daughter-in-law set up," I said. "My memory isn't what it used to be." "Could you explain the difference between the trustee and the beneficiary again?" I let my voice tremble slightly. He smiled as if soothing a child. "Of course," he said. "The trustee holds legal title and manages the assets. The beneficiary enjoys the benefits. In some trusts, the roles are separate. In others, they can be the same person. For example, your daughter-in-law is set to become both when certain conditions are met, namely if your son defaults on his debts." "And who decides if those conditions are met?" I asked. "The trustee does," he said too quickly. I nodded slowly as if digesting. In truth, I was recording every word on a small digital recorder hidden in my jacket pocket. This stayed as one-party consent. I was in the room. The recording would hold. His admission that she could declare her own conditions triggered every ethical alarm. We spoke for another 20 minutes as he tried to sell me on modernizing our estate plan. I smiled, thanked him, and left with a brochure I would never read. In the parking lot, I replayed the conversation. He had confirmed what I suspected. She and he were colluding to strip my son of legal title. I added his words to my counter-strike file. That night, I wrote a bar complaint on legal paper, detailing his conflict of interest and the fraudulent scheme. I'd learned long ago that sometimes revenge is as simple as filling out the right forms. With evidence gathered and allies alerted, it was time to fortify what mattered. I met with our longtime attorney, Ms. Davis, a woman whose handshake was firmer than most men's. Her office walls were lined with pictures of her climbing mountains. I trusted her because she'd helped me draft the original trust for the business decades ago. "I need to move Whitaker Enterprises into a charitable foundation," I told her. "I want to retain lifetime control, but I don't want a single blood relative to have the power to sell it or borrow against it. Ever." She raised an eyebrow, then smiled. "Going nuclear, Harold?" "Call it insurance," I said. "I've seen enough." We spent hours drafting the documents. The foundation would own the business. I would be its president until I died or chose to step down. After that, a board of local community members and employees would run it. Profits would fund scholarships and local charities. No one could touch the principal. Not my daughter-in-law, not even my son. Next, I went to the bank and met with Karen again. "Cancel the automatic mortgage transfers from our accounts to the villa in Florida," I told her. "Close the joint account in my son's name that you set up last month. Transfer the remaining funds back into the business account. Effective immediately." She hesitated. "Sir?" She stopped herself. "Mr. Whitaker, are you sure?" "I'm as sure as I have ever been," I said, looking her in the eye. "Do it." She clicked her mouse, typed something, and then looked up. "Done." The word felt like a gavel strike. I signed forms revoking her access and noted the date, the 15th. I hadn't chosen that arbitrarily. I wanted her to feel the reversal exactly when she expected to siphon funds again. Back home, I sat in my study, poured myself a glass of whiskey, and toasted the man in my father's portrait. "To the foundation," I said. The amber liquid tasted like resolve. My plan would be stronger if she incriminated herself. So, I set a trap. I invited our family and a few close employees to dinner that weekend under the pretense of celebrating my parents' anniversary. I asked my daughter-in-law to help me set the table, knowing she couldn't resist the chance to play hostess. Earlier that day, I placed several copies of bank statements in the drawer of the hall table. They were marked with red circles around the fraudulent transfers. I slipped a handwritten note between them. Payment due, $250,000. Urgent! I left the drawer slightly ajar. I also installed a small camera behind a bookshelf angled to capture anyone who opened the drawer. It was a habit from my days in counterintelligence. Always document. When she arrived, she floated through the house, complimenting the flowers and rearranging plates. I watched her glance at the hall table and hesitate. She waited until she thought I was out of sight. Then she pulled the drawer open. Her eyes widened as she saw the statements. She flipped through them quickly, then snapped a photo with her phone. The camera caught it all. During dinner, she seemed distracted, checking her phone under the table. She laughed too loudly at jokes and refilled her own wine more often than others. My son noticed nothing. He was busy telling a story about our first factory. I sat at the head of the table, sipping lemonade, and memorized her tells. The tapping foot, the tight smile. At the end of the night, I locked the camera footage in my safe. I labeled the file hall drawer and placed it behind the banks folder. The trap had worked. She'd shown curiosity and fear. I now had visual proof of her awareness of the fraud. It wasn't enough to convict her on its own, but it would undermine any claim that she was ignorant. Now I just needed her to say it out loud. On the morning of the 15th, the day she expected another siphon, I met Ms. Davis at the courthouse. We filed the deeds transferring Whitaker Enterprises to the Whitaker Foundation. We submitted the paperwork creating the board, the bylaws, and the irrevocable clauses. We filed the bar complaint against Mark Jensen. I watched the clerk stamp each document with the official seal. The thud of the stamp was satisfying. As we left the courthouse, Ms. Davis handed me a copy of the file. "It's done," she said. "She can't touch it." In the parking lot, I sat in my truck and flipped through the pages again. The trust instrument was elegant in its simplicity. It named me as president, defined the purpose of the foundation, and stated in plain language that no relative could sell or encumber the business. It referenced the cases I'd studied as a young man and the mistakes I'd seen. It was the culmination of months of work and decades of experience. I thought about my father, who had mortgaged our farm to start the business after the war. I thought about my son, who had expanded it and hired veterans. I thought about the grandchildren yet to understand the weight of what we had built. In that parking lot, I whispered to myself, "Canceled." Effective immediately, those words weren't for show. They were a statement of fact. 2 days later, we gathered again, this time ostensibly to discuss the upcoming holiday. I had told my son privately that we needed to talk. He arrived with hope in his eyes and worry on his brow. My daughter-in-law wore a new bracelet and the same smile she'd always used when she wanted something. We sat in the living room. "You're humiliating me," he said. "No," I said. "I'm stopping the part of you that sells our name for quiet." I handed my son a thick envelope. "Read these," I said. "Quietly." He opened it and paled as he saw the bank statements, the forged invoices, the handwritten notes. He looked up at me. "What is this?" I turned to her. "Why don't you explain?" She laughed. "Harold, what are you doing? These are my personal consulting files. You had no right to snoop." Her voice had a tremor. "They're not your files," I said calmly. "They're my company's money. And you've been stealing it." "That's absurd," she snapped. "I was helping diversify the business." Mark said. "Mark Jensen?" I interrupted. "The lawyer who admitted on tape that you would become trustee and beneficiary upon my son's default? The lawyer who is now facing a bar complaint? That Mark?" I placed the digital recorder on the coffee table and pressed play. Jensen's voice filled the room. "In some trusts, the roles can be the same person." She lunged for the recorder. I was faster than she expected. For an old man, I still had quick hands. I picked it up and pocketed it. "Sit down," I said. She sat. My son stared at her, betrayal twisting his features. "Why?" he asked. It was the only word he could muster. She rolled her eyes. "Because you're weak," she said softly. "You spend money on employees and charities and veterans. You don't think about growth or luxury. I was building an empire. Her honesty surprised even her. We already have an empire, I replied. One built on honest work and trust. And now it's protected. Whitaker Enterprises no longer belongs to the family. It belongs to the foundation. You will never touch it. She stood, her face flushing. You can't do that, she said. I'll sue. You can try, I said. But the deeds are filed. The business is no longer in our names. The accounts are closed. The mortgages are canceled. Effective immediately. My son covered his face with his hands. The room was silent except for the ticking of the old mantel clock. Her wine glass trembled in her hand. She set it down before it shattered. She realized she'd lost everything she thought was hers. After that night, panic set in. She spent the next morning on the phone, pacing the patio with bare feet on cold stone. I watched from the kitchen window as she dialed number after number. I need to speak to Karen in accounts, she said into her phone. I'm Mrs. Whitaker. It's urgent. I imagined Karen's response. I'm sorry, but you no longer have access. She called Mark Jensen's office. The line went straight to voicemail. His license had been suspended pending investigation. She called another bank in Florida. They told her the mortgage payments had been canceled. She called her mother and cried. I could hear her through the window, her voice cracking on the words foundation and revoked. In the afternoon, she stormed into my study without knocking. You've humiliated me, she said. You've ruined us. I've given my life to this family, I stood and faced her. You've taken from this family, I corrected. You've tried to ruin my son. And you miscalculated. You thought I was just an old man with a fishing pole. I spent my life tracking criminals with more sophistication than you. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on the safe. She stepped toward it. Open it, she demanded. I deserve to see what you've taken from me. No, I said. The word hung between us like a solid object. That safe holds the history of this family. You will never see what's in it. She shook her head and laughed bitterly. You think this is over? I'll go to the media. I'll say you abuse me. I'll say you forged my signature. Let them panic. Let them make mistakes, I murmured, more to myself than to her. My father's voice echoed in my memory. She didn't know the context. She frowned. What did you say? She snapped. I said you should leave my study, I answered. She turned on her heel and slammed the door. For the first time in months, my study was mine again. A month later, we sat in a courtroom. The wood paneling and stiff-backed chairs were familiar. I'd testified in federal cases before. This time I sat at the plaintiff's table with Miss Davis and my son. Across from us sat my daughter-in-law and her new attorney, a man who looked like he'd just graduated law school. Mark Jensen was nowhere to be seen. The judge entered, an older woman with kind eyes. The bailiff called the case. Ms. Davis stood and presented our evidence. The bank statements, the forged invoices, the recording of Mark Jensen explaining how the trust had been set up to allow my daughter-in-law to declare my son in default. We submitted the video from the hall drawer showing her rifling through the statements. We presented testimony from Pete Reynolds about the offshore accounts. Her attorney objected often. Hearsay, he said. Irrelevant. The judge overruled most of them. When my daughter-in-law took the stand, she tried to paint herself as a visionary. I wanted to modernize the company, she said. Harold refused. He's stuck in the past. Did you transfer funds into shell corporations without authorization? Ms. Davis asked. She hesitated. I delegated tasks to consultants. Did you sign invoices for services never rendered? I don't recall, she said, her voice small. The judge leaned forward. Answer the question. Yes, she whispered. My son closed his eyes. He had not spoken during the proceedings. His hands were folded in his lap, knuckles white. When the last witness finished, the judge looked over her glasses and said, I find sufficient evidence for this matter to proceed to trial. I am also referring Mr. Jensen's conduct to the state bar and forwarding the record to the district attorney. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down like thunder. 2 weeks later, the sheriff knocked on our door. I had been expecting him. I offered him coffee. He declined. My daughter-in-law was upstairs packing. She thought she had time to flee. She didn't. "Mrs. Whitaker," the sheriff called up the stairs, "we have a warrant for your arrest." She appeared at the top, suitcase in hand. "You can't be serious," she said. "Fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy," he replied. "Please come with us." She looked at me, eyes blazing. "You did this," she hissed. "You've destroyed this family." I met her gaze. "No," I said softly. "You did." I just shone a light on it. The deputies cuffed her gently. It was a small mercy. She tried to speak to my son, but he turned away. The sheriff led her out to the driveway. The sun was bright. Neighbors pretended not to watch. I stood on the porch, hands in my pockets, and listened as the car door closed. The siren wailed as they drove away. The sound faded, leaving only birdsong and the hum of cicadas. In the quiet that followed, I walked back inside. The house felt different, lighter. I had a moment of peace I had not felt since opening that laptop. Everything was restoring. Later that evening, my son and I sat in my study. The Counter-Strike file lay open on the desk. He held a photograph of my father, the one that hung on the wall. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his voice raw. "Because you loved her," I said. "You needed to see it yourself. If I'd told you before I had proof, you would have thought I was being paranoid, and she would have covered her tracks." He nodded slowly. "I feel like a fool." "You're not," I said. "You trusted someone you loved." "That isn't foolish. It's human." He flipped through the pages of the file. "You kept everything," he said. "Of course," I replied. "Paper doesn't lie. People do." We talked late into the night. I explained how I'd traced the funds, why I'd moved the business, how I'd recorded the lawyer. I told him about the foundation and the scholarships. He listened, sometimes smiling at my audacity. When I finished, he leaned back and sighed. "Thank you," he said. "You saved my life." I looked at him. My son, grown, gray at the temples, still the boy who'd learned addition at this desk. "I saved our family's work," I said. "You still have to rebuild trust with our employees and our community. They need to know we stand for something." We closed the Counter-Strike file together. I placed it in the safe, behind the folder labeled Family. It would stay there until I was gone. In the months that followed, we worked to rebuild trust. I wrote letters to our clients explaining the transition to the Whitaker Foundation. I met with employees and assured them their jobs were secure. Some hugged me. Others cried. They had feared for their livelihoods. Now they knew the company would outlive us all. We created a board of directors composed of long-term employees, veterans, and members of the local community. They would guide the company's mission and ensure profits went to scholarships and charities. My son stepped aside as CEO and took a role on the board. "It's bigger than me now," he said. He was right. We hosted a town hall in the factory floor. I stood at a podium made from one of our shipping crates and spoke plainly. "We built this company on trust," I said. "That trust was broken, but not by you. The business is now owned by a foundation that will serve our community forever. No one person can ever take it. Not even me." There was applause. There were questions. We answered them all. Transparency was our best tool now. One afternoon, I received a note on my desk. It was from Maria, who had worked in accounting for 20 years. It read, "Thank you for protecting our family. My husband's chemotherapy is covered because of you." I tucked the note into the family folder in the safe. It reminded me why we did this. The truth was on my side. Seasons turned, leaves reddened and fell. Trials began and ended. She was convicted and sentenced to prison. The house felt quiet but not empty. My grandson Ethan began spending weekends with me. He was 13, curious, lanky, with his father's eyes and his mother's smile. One Saturday we went fishing. Sitting in the boat, lines in the water, I told him stories of my father. He listened, then asked, "Grandpa, why do people steal?" I considered. "Some are greedy," I said. "Some are scared. Some think they deserve more than they've earned. But that's not important. What matters is that you know how to protect what you build and that you share your blessings wisely." He nodded. "Dad says you saved the company." "We saved it," I corrected. "Your dad and the people who work there. And now you're part of it. When you're ready, I'll show you how it works." Back at the house, I took him to the study. I spun the safe's dial. "Don't look," I teased. He laughed. Inside, I handed him a small envelope. It contained the new combination written in my hand. "One day," I said, "you'll need this. Not because you'll have to fight someone. I pray you never do. But because this family's history is in here. You need to know it." He hugged me, his arms tight around my waist. "You're old-fashioned," he said, grinning. "So are good things like honesty and hard work," I replied. It was the passing of the combination to the next generation, a quiet transfer of responsibility, not of assets. In the quiet after the storm, I found myself sitting at my desk once more, the Counter-Strike file now sealed away. The house creaked with age and memory. The pond outside reflected a sky pink with dawn. I held a mug of coffee in hands that had signed checks, held children, and now steadied themselves for rest. I thought about how close we came to losing everything. I thought about the nights spent tracing numbers, the fear of confrontation, the relief of execution. I felt no joy in my daughter-in-law's downfall. I felt only relief that my son was spared and that our employees were safe. Justice is not vengeance, it is balance restored. I set boundaries with the remaining family. I sold the vacation home in Florida. I donated its proceeds to the foundation. I told my son that if he ever remarried, we would have frank conversations about trusts and titles. I planned to travel to the national parks my wife and I once dreamed of visiting. I'd fish more, read more, maybe write down the family history for Ethan. As the sun rose fully, I wrote a letter to myself and placed it in the safe. It read, "If you ever doubt the value of vigilance, remember this." I smiled. Life would go on, but it would be lived on my terms. You have heard my story. You know the choices I made and the reasons behind them. I am an old man who refused to be dismissed. Justice required action, family required protection, and dignity required silence when others would shout. Now I ask you, as I close this chapter and begin the next, what would you have done to protect your own? Please share your opinion in the comments.
My grandpa's words really happened. I believe him. If you want more true tales stories like this, hit subscribe.